Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. We have a packed show this week, so I want to jump right into it. We're talking about arcades and arcade memories. On the show today, I have Clint from Lazy Game Reviews on YouTube, but we also hear from the 8-Bit guy, David Murray, and Colin from the YouTube channel This Does Not Compute. So let's start with the conversation with Clint from LGR. Speaking of older experiences with older hardware, I wanted to talk about arcades and some memories with arcades, and we'll maybe talk about, well, we definitely will talk about your arcade machine coming up, but I want to talk about any experience you might have going to the arcade. Was there an arcade in your town that you would frequent, and what was your experience just overall in arcades?
Yeah, for me, it was, I had definitely had more experiences at the random places you would just see arcade machines so much, instead of arcades themselves. There was one arcade at Aladdin's Castle. That was like the big one. But yeah, I didn't go there nearly as much. It was mostly places like a bowling alley or a skating rink or, a little convenience store down the road or hotel or whatever, just anywhere that had a cool game. Didn't really matter what it was. That became a destination for me and my friends. So yeah. It was just keeping an eye out for those big beautiful machines and looking at the cool new artwork, and you just never knew what could possibly be coming up next because it's not like there were there were arcade magazines and probably websites or something way back then, but like I wasn't seeing any of them, and who knows? It was just like the luck of the draw. You go into a new place and there was a new game. It's like, oh man, what is this Cruisin' USA? Where did that come from? Nintendo made it? What?
So one of my vivid memories on that note of not going to a specific arcade, but just going into different places, gas stations, Pizza Huts, hotels. There was one game that when arcades kind of started dying off in the 90s-ish, late 90s-ish, when you would go to hotels that would have a couple of, and this is a pun, a couple of token arcade machines somewhere down in the lobby or down in a basement somewhere, whatever. Would you agree that one of them was always pole position?
Yeah, and it was always broken. The stupid thing never worked.
Yes, and sometimes you'd be lucky. You would be lucky if your parents booked a hotel or a motel somewhere, and it definitely had pole position, and it was one of the stand-up versions, but had the pedals in the steering wheel.
Yeah, I specifically remember one of those, and for some reason the pedal never worked. I never got to play it until years later. But on a similar vein, one of the others that I always saw was the upright version of Outrun. And, yeah, very very similar thing. And man, you'd hear that music, that there's like 4 radio station tracks just playing on this loop. It was like, oh yeah, it's a good time coming up. It got an Outrun cabinet, so yeah.
Oh yeah.
Lovely.
And one of the biggest things that blew my little geek mind when I was, how old was I? Maybe 9, 10, or 11. This would have coincided with arcades kind of in their slump, going out of style. In that in that era, you saw more and more arcades with price tags on them. Like the owner was trying just to liquidate and sell all of his inventory because he wasn't making any money on the arcade anymore.
Right.
And when I first saw a price tag on an arcade machine, it blew my mind. I was like, wait a second. People can actually have these in their house. I couldn't believe it. Did you ever experience anything similar?
Oh yeah, and again, it wasn't much until later on, maybe like you said, into the 90s or something. And I remember seeing. I believe it was what was that? I don't know. I guess it was just called Battletoads, the Battletoads arcade game. And that one was for sale at the local skating rink. And it was amazing. It was like $300 too.
Really?
It was super cheap. Like, it was, again, like 1999, maybe the year 2000. And so they were just trying to unload their crap. Like, they didn't, they didn't have the room for it anymore. I think the skating rink was about to shut down anyway. And like, yeah, it was just there. And all their arcade machines, most of them were gone, but they had that one left over there and right next to where you can get pizza. It was a greasy machine, but it was great. Three player gigantic control panel. And Battletoads. Yeah, it was like $300. I wanted it so bad, of course, but I was like, I was 14. So nope.
Yeah. Did you? So when I first saw one for sale, though I knew the answer was going to be just a bewildered no from my mom, I still pointed to the $1,200 arcade machine and said, "Mom, can we please buy that?" And she's just like, "No. Are you crazy? Absolutely not. $1,200? We will never have one of those in the house. Where would we put it? It's as big as a car. It's just not happening. Get it out of your head." She said it in a much more loving way, but that was the main sentiment. Did you ever ask your parents to buy you an arcade machine once you realized they were for sale?
I don't think I ever did. I mostly was just begging for computer hardware. I'm like, I could just play these arcade games at home. They got that version of the game at Software Center, and I can buy it for the PC. So yeah, it never seemed like a realistic goal until adulthood. Even though I knew that you could buy them, I'm like, well, yeah, but where would you put it? Even I was thinking practically as a kid. It's like, we wouldn't have anywhere to put that. Like, sure, that's stupid.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll get to our actually buying an arcade machine in a second. But what was your favorite game at the arcade? All arcades considered, no matter where you were, if you saw this game, it was your favorite, you would immediately go play it.
Raiden 2.
Raiden 2?
Yeah, it's like a vertically scrolling shooter.
Yeah.
1993, I think. 94 maybe, by... Yeah, it was one of those like conversion boards, apparently. I guess they never actually sold it as a dedicated machine, or if they did, I never saw one. Every time I saw it, it was like another cabinet had been converted to that, and they just had like a marquee set up. But yeah, it was great. That was the one with the purple laser, like the toothpaste laser that goes around and just like connects to all the enemies when you shoot it. So that was my jam right there.
Squirting toothpaste at all the... had all the enemies on the screen.
Laser just zapping away enemies. It was way too fun. Had great sound, great music, just fantastic visuals, and it was like jet fighters with lasers. Couldn't get any better than that.
And we'll leave the conversation there for now, because when we come back, we're going to check in with the 8-bit guy and his arcade memories. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I am your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and in this broadcast, we've been talking about arcades and arcade memories. Clint from Lazy Game Reviews on YouTube, LGR, has been my guest, and we'll pick up that conversation in a minute. But I wanted to check in with another friend of the show, the 8-bit guy, David Murray, on his arcade memories. David?
Hi, Johnny. So, my arcade experiences are probably a lot different from how most people probably imagine. I know there's this stereotype that all of us kids that grew up in the 80s spent all of our time in the arcades, and we were poking one quarter after another into the arcade machines and playing all day. But the reality is I didn't have a whole lot of money when I was a kid, so I was smart enough to look at the arcade machine and go, well, gee, I could waste a few dollars worth of quarters, playing this arcade. Or I could save this money and I could buy something for my actual computer, or maybe even a game for my Atari 2600 or something like that I could physically own. And so the reality is I didn't spend a lot of money on arcades. One thing I will mention, though, and I think maybe a lot of young people today don't realize this, is there were arcade machines outside of the arcade, right? I mean, the arcade would be like a place you would go and there's 100 arcade machines in there, and you would spend a lot of money and you would spend some time in there playing. But it was really common for grocery stores. I mean, our local Walmart, for example, always had 4 or 5 arcade games out there in the main entryway to the store. right along where the like soda machines and stuff like that would have been. And you'd also find arcade machines in like laundromats and even restaurants. I mean, not like fancy restaurants, but usually like, fast food type restaurants. I seem to recall seeing them in Dairy Queen and, McDonald's and places like that. You go in the front and there just be maybe just one or two arcade machines, not usually a whole lot, just a few of them. So it seemed like they were everywhere you went. There was at least one or two. And so admittedly, I did spend money, like when my family went out to eat at the restaurant. I was done eating, and I was bored, right? Not like I had a cell phone or anything like that to play with. So, I'd always ask, mom or dad, oh, hey, can I have a quarter to go play, Miss Pac-Man or Rally X or Xevious or whatever they happen to have in that particular arcade. And most of the time they'd give me a quarter and I'd go play that. Of course, by the time I was done with that, the family was ready to go home. And so that's primarily, I would say, most of my exposure to arcade games was outside of the arcade and actually inside smaller establishments that just happen to always have 2 or 3 arcades, and don't really see that much anymore. That's something I actually kind of miss, but I guess those days are long gone. So I will mention one other little funny anecdote. So like I mentioned, our local Walmart did have like usually 3 or 4 arcade machines in the front entryway to the store. But they also had this other machine, and I don't know what it was called, but my brother and I just called it the chicken machine. And it wasn't an arcade. It was this machine that that had like this big tank of eggs, and on top of it was this big chicken. And you'd put a quarter into it, and you'd push the button, and it'd go, bark, 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 and a little chicken would spin around, and then an egg would pop out the bottom, and then you'd open the egg, and there'd be some kind of surprise in there. I mean, it could be like you never knew what it was going to be. It could be like a piece of gum or a ring or a little book of tattoos or, whatever little kind of prizes are usually pretty worthless. But anyway, we discovered one day when we went into the store that, the AC power connector for the machine was actually about 2 foot over on the wall from where the machine was. So it was really easy just to walk up to it and grab the power connector. And one day we were just kind of bored waiting at Walmart, and we're like, hey, let's see what happens if we pull this plug out. So we pulled the plug and we plugged it back in the wall, and the machine started up, and then it popped an egg out. And then we realized that every time you unplug the machine and plug it back in, it would basically dispense a free egg. And, well, like I said, most of the time the prizes inside the eggs were pretty useless. It still became a ritual of ours that every time we went into the Walmart, we would unplug and plug the chicken machine back in and just, get a free egg or two. And we just thought that was funny. But, yeah, we usually end up throwing the stuff in the trash because it was pretty worthless. But it's still a funny memory.
Thanks, David. I like how it went from saving your quarters to buy your own video games to petty theft. That's a pretty well-rounded childhood right there. All right, let's pick up the conversation with Clint from LGR. Arcades, they hit a slump in the 80s. They were very popular in the early 80s, and then right towards the 90s, arcades were dying. And then Street Fighter 2 came along in 1991 in the arcades, and it caused this resurgence of interest and popularity with arcades. People were going to the arcades to play Street Fighter 2. Midway capitalized on it and took it another level with Mortal Kombat, adding blood and violence and that whole controversy in the early 90s. But also, I think Street Fighter 2 saved and killed the arcade at the same time, because Street Fighter 2 was ported to Super Nintendo. It was also on Sega Genesis, but it was ported to the Super Nintendo, and it was almost a perfect port from the arcade. And that was kind of the death nail in arcades when video game systems, consoles, Super Nintendo, 16-bit, 32-bit, and what have you, got powerful enough that they were equally as good and even better than the PCB-based arcade games. And I just thought that was interesting that Street Fighter 2, kind of saved the arcades briefly and then killed it again. It's kind of a sad story when you think about it, unless you really love Street Fighter 2 like me, and then it's just part of history. Do you have any sort of insight on that?
Yeah, I'd say it's a worthy sacrifice. We got Street Fighter 2 out of it. But at the same time, yeah, it was definitely one of those weird moments in time. Yeah, I certainly played Street Fighter 2 Turbo way more on the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo than I ever did in the arcades. I don't even know if I saw it in the arcades until years later.
Yeah.
It was just, it was one of those things. It seems like it was always there, and everybody had a copy. Everybody had a copy. It didn't matter, man. I knew a kid who bought a copy and didn't even have a console to play it on yet. He just bought it.
Yeah,
he just wanted it, and he read the manual. He wore that manual out, just looking at it. And it was one of those iconic things. As soon as it came out, you knew it was something special. And yeah, and then there were like 14 different versions after that, and I think that was when I started seeing it show up in the arcades. So it was like Turbo Champion World Edition XX something. I was like, oh my god, how many more characters are going to add to this? So,
there was a time through the 90s and early 2000s where Street Fighter EX, the weirdest thing was Street Fighter 2 the movie.
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
Arcade game. It was so crazy because it was a video game that became a movie that became a video game.
That's the one where they tried to do like the digitized sprites of the actors, right?
Right, like Mortal Kombat.
Yeah. That was a janky game.
So you had Jean-Claude Van Damme as Guile and all the other characters in the movie, but in the game. And yeah, it was kind of janky, but I went back and played it through an emulator, and it was better than I remembered. It is by no means as iconic, and the controls are nowhere near as flawless and perfect as Street Fighter 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter 3. Street Fighter 3 Third Strike is one of my favorite entries in the entire Street Fighter series. But the Street Fighter movie arcade game, it actually, I could throw some Hadoukens with Ryu. I could do the Dragon Punches. It just looked really. It should have never been a live action video game in my opinion. But what are you gonna do? Yeah.
So all that, it kind of makes me miss the times when all these movies had games made out of them. I mean, that one makes a lot of sense, but like modern day movie games just aren't really what they used to. You get like a mobile game and that's about it. But then like back then you get an entire arcade machine with your movie on it, or a pinball game or something like that. I love pinball, and giant rabbit hole you go down sometime, but yeah.
And we'll leave the conversation with Clint there for now, because when we come back, we're going to check in with Colin from This Does Not Compute. Plenty more Geek Therapy Radio to come. We're talking arcades. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. We'll continue the arcade conversation with Clint in a moment, but I want to check in with Colin from This Does Not Compute. Colin, what are your arcade memories?
Hey, Johnny. I think if you were to ask the average person who grew up in the 80s and early 90s what a memory of going to a video arcade was for them, they'd probably tell you a story about how they went to a friend's birthday party at some place like Chuck E. Cheese. And I definitely have memories like that myself, although growing up in Minnesota, we had Circus instead, pretty much the same thing. Now, I think a lot of those sorts of places kind of skewed towards the younger demographics, and if my experience was representative of a lot of others, then I'd say most people were more interested in the ticket machines than in the video games, trying to gain all those tickets so that they can trade them in for some really cheap prize. And I do definitely treasure those experiences, but the thing that really stuck out to me was actually from later on. It was probably around my junior high to early high school kind of years. I was never really much of a mall rat, although I did go periodically with friends. Of course, it's just one of the things that we did during the time period. And I was fortunate enough that there was an arcade at the mall. The only other option would have really just been the video game display section tucked into the corner of the boys' clothing department at Sears. If shout out if anyone remembers that. But this arcade wasn't terribly huge, but it had a decent selection and kind of across a wide genre of gaming. Of course, it had those ticket-based machines and skee-ball and the coin pushers and all that. And there was the back row of pinball machines, but kind of spread right around the middle of it was a decent selection of relatively new video game cabinets. And it was that arcade that got me introduced to a genre of gaming that up to that point I hadn't really had much experience with firsthand. And that was those kind of clean, technical fighters. I spent so much time and quarters on the cabinets for just Virtua Fighter and Tekken, like it's not even funny. And I think part of why I was so interested in those games was because it was a genre that I hadn't really had much exposure to previously. Up until going to that arcade, all the video gaming experience I really had was just at home, either on my own console or on that of a friend. So generally the genres of games that I played or had access to were platformers and puzzlers and maybe some RPGs. So to see a more, I guess, like grown up or adult genre of gaming was really new and fresh to me, and yet it still felt a lot of fun. You could approach one of those games with kind of a variety of skills and still leave feeling somewhat satisfied. I mean, if you were new at it and very unskilled like I was, I mean, you'd sit there and mash buttons and you'd win the first few rounds and you'd feel good about that. And by the time that was over, there was probably somebody else who wanted to play. So it was a good excuse, when you lost, to step away and go do something else for a while. But if you were good, then you'd keep progressing through and gain more skill as it took, longer and longer levels for you to get beat by the computer. So that genre of gaming really kind of stuck with me, and I'm still a fan of those titles to this day. The other thing that was really compelling about those particular games is that in some ways they were a showcase of where the technology was going. They were trying to show off the best in terms of performance and graphics quality. And during that time period, generally arcade cabinets were at least one generation, if not more, ahead of what was available for home gaming. You knew that within a few years, a new console would come out that would look that good, and you'd be able to even maybe play those exact games at home. And indeed, I ended up picking up copies of Tekken and Virtua Fighter for my own consoles over the years. Now, strangely enough, I never actually got all that good at those genres of games. I'm not quite sure why, given how much time and money I spent on them. But even then, I'm still a big fan of those titles, and I really kind of miss those days. Of course, arcades have taken on a completely different role these days. They're no longer the showcases of the latest technology and graphics performance like they were back then. And so, in a way, that makes me really appreciate the time that I spent in high school and junior high playing those games, because I was able to experience that firsthand. I was able to really kind of appreciate where the gaming technology was going, instead of these days looking at arcades as more of a nostalgic experience. Back then, stuff was cutting edge. It was exciting. It got you excited for what was upcoming, and it gave you a really good chance to socialize with your friends. And while I don't think that socialization aspect has really diminished, I think the impressiveness of the experience is definitely something that's one for the history books.
Thank you so much for that, Colin. Colin from the YouTube channel, This Does Not Compute. Check him out. Yeah, I vividly remember playing Tekken in an old bowling alley arcade and asking bigger kids to help teach me some moves. But what about pinball machines? Let's dive right back into our conversation with Clint from LGR.
Do you want a pinball machine?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Do you have any plans to get one?
Yeah, I would love to. I don't plan on doing that anytime soon, just because I don't have the room. But I would make room, if the right one came along at the right price or something.
Yeah, get one of those Murphy beds, the kind of beds that fold up into the wall.
Right.
just and keep the arcade machine on casters.
I would sleep on the machine if I needed to, man. I'll just make it my bed.
Yes. Yes, just throw a little mattress on top of the like a Dracula pinball.
Oh, for sure. I get like
machine.
a giant one of those Hercules tables. It's like the size of a real life bed. So there you go.
Dude, yeah. Oh man, you're putting all sorts of nonsense ideas into my mind, and my wife is probably listening to this saying, "Don't you even think about where are we going to put an arcade machine?" But I do have a stand-up arcade machine. I've got a Konami cabinet, and I've gone a little different route than you have thus far, Clint. I wanted, back when Street Fighter 4 came out. A couple years after it came out, actually, I would scour Google Maps and scour Craigslist and scour just the city of Houston for any arcades or any like businesses that had Street Fighter 4 arcade machines. I had the idea, well, there's not very many. Maybe there's 2 Japanese import Street Fighter 4 arcade machines in Houston. I'm just going to build my own. And that's exactly what I did with an old Konami cabinet that I found on Craigslist for maybe $30. And here's the thing about arcade machines, and you know this, Clint. They are cumbersome, and they are tough to move around, and tough to load and unload on things, and tough to drag across the floor. One of the things that was very important to me was the sound. And I was able to achieve the perfect sound, in my opinion, for what I wanted in this Frankenstein machine. I had an old Dell multimedia speaker system, the 2.1 with the 2 little small speakers in the subwoofer, and I have the small speakers up underneath the marquee aimed down at the glass that's angled back at your face so you can hear all the mid-range and high range perfectly. And then you have the subwoofer in the cabinet with the perfect amount of bass, the perfect amount of thud for the arcade machines, because that was important. And I love that I finally have an arcade machine in my house. Clint, that was very long-winded of me. I apologize. I really want to hear about your arcade machine.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. That's kind of where I started, actually, was doing rigs like what you're describing. In fact, I still have my X-Arcade tank stick and everything from when I had that kind of setup going on.
Cool.
So, yeah, before I got into, getting a real arcade machine recently, I was all in a MAME and just setting up all those kind of setups any way that I possibly could. And I did the same thing with a little Logitech 2.1 speaker system. That does a very good job in a case.
Yeah.
But, the one that I have now is a Missile Command cabinet by Atari from 1980, and it is the Cabaret cabinet. So
nice.
It's like a 3/4 size almost, so it's a little bit smaller, but the controls and everything are pretty much full size, except the trackball. Trackball is like about the size of a pool ball or something, instead of like the big, huge, chunky one that's on the full size machine. It fills up your entire hand. But, as soon as I saw that thing for sale locally, I absolutely had to grab it. The Atari released a bunch of these Cabaret cabinets back in the day for, Asteroids and Missile Command and Centipede and just tons of games, but they all came in the exact same cabinet. And that was one of the reasons I liked it. I liked the idea of it because there's no artwork on it at all. It's just a big wood grain cabinet. And the marquee is the only thing separating it from any of the others, and of course they could just swap that out with all the other games. So I love that thing, and it's an absolute beast. I did not realize it was going to be that big, even for being a quote-unquote smaller machine. It's still huge, absolutely huge.
And we're going to take one more commercial break. We'll leave the conversation there for now. We're going to come back to Clint from LGR, Lazy Game Reviews on YouTube. Go subscribe right now. We'll continue the conversation about arcade memories. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. Let's dive right back into the conversation with Clint from LGR on YouTube about his vintage arcade machine. So is it original to the 80s, or is it a more recent?
It's all original. There's nothing that's been swapped out except for the trackball and the coin door. That's about it. Everything else is pretty much the same.
And last I was watching the last little, I believe it was the last little thing you've done on it. Have you made any progress with the coin mechanism, or have it hooked up in a way that actually that works, or do you just leave it in free play mode?
Yeah, coin door works now. So I got some new mechs and put in there and sort of repaired the little rails that the coins slide down. And the reject buttons, like the red buttons, those were sticking. So I've redone that entire coin door. And even got like a nice little tray in there and put a couple $100 quarters. Oh no, more than that. I put a lot of quarters. I just went to the bank. I'm like, give me a couple $100 in quarters. So I just loaded it up because it doesn't sound right if you insert coins into an arcade machine and it doesn't clunk into a bunch of other quarters. So
see,
have the sound.
That's that right there. That sentence that you just said. That is why we love you. It's not just about putting the quarter into the machine. The whole experience has to be authentic from start to finish. The quarter has to roll down the rails and it has to fall into a pile of other quarters, or else it is incomplete in your book.
Yeah, for sure. It was not right at all, and it was just clunking into a little plastic bin. And the coin mechs that I had in there originally, they were plastic as well. Those they were like cheaply put together, just garbage coin mechs, and they weren't working. So somebody sent me some metal ones, like all metal construction coin mechs, and they sound amazing. So
nice. Nice. One of the awesome things about having your own arcade cabinet also is that, true to the arcade experience, something that we've all experienced, those of us who've had the privilege of growing up with arcades, is sure, the Street Fighter, there's one Street Fighter 2 arcade machine open. There's like, at that time there was a bank of, in bigger arcades, 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 Street Fighter 2 arcade cabinets. And then there's one that was open, that was always open. Like, sweet, my lucky day. And you walk up to it and it was open because the controls are always sticky and filthy with dried up sticky corn syrup, Coke and soda and crumbs of cheese sticks and things like that. But when you have your own arcade machine, you can clean that all up, maintain it, be sure that there's no Coca-Cola spilling into the buttons and coin mechanisms. Would that, if someone came over to your house and accidentally spilled a little bit of Coke on your arcade machine, what would your response be? Would we have to call the police?
I don't think it'd be that bad. I've had somebody spill beer on it already, so it's okay.
What? But that's okay. So I guess that's part of the authentic experience anyway. Someone's going to spill something on it.
Yeah, they're made to be used and abused. So I use and abuse it, man. I got a drink thing set up right next to it, a little table. So it's meant to be used. I don't have any cigarette burns on it yet. That'll maybe.
You're gonna pick up smoking just to put some ashes and cigarette burns on it.
Every time somebody sees it, like, where are the cigarette burns? This doesn't look legit at all. There's always one of those on those, and it smelled like cigarettes when I got it. Like, I don't smoke. Nobody here smokes, but like if I hadn't cleaned it out, that thing would have just been. It just smelled like an ashtray. I mean, and that's kind of, again, that's like part of it. A lot of these machines were in especially these cabinets like I have, like the little cabaret. I mean, it's kind of in the name, right? It's made for, little tiny backroom bars and hotels and lounges and stuff. Mm-hmm. And, but it'd be also great to just have somewhere to work on my stupid machine because the thing breaks all the time. That's another thing that I knew getting into the arcade experience, but I didn't know that like 90% of the time it'd just be broken. It's seriously just, it's part of it. You accept that. Yeah.
I mean, it's exactly like having an old car.
Yeah, you very much is.
You don't buy a classic car and then be bummed that there's something wrong with it. The type of person who buys an old classic car is the type of person who loves working with their hands. They love being tactile. They love, the smell of oil in this case. They love working with the metal, sometimes with the wood and the rubber and all the visceral experience that goes into keeping a car like that and all the love that goes into keeping a car like that on the road. And it's an extremely similar thing, I would imagine, and from what you're telling me, with an old arcade machine that the reason why it works is because you put actual real love into maintaining it. As of right now, as of us speaking right now and recording right now, is it operational?
I think so. Last time I checked a couple days ago, but man, it's got gremlins. That's just how it is. It's 40 years old. It's a cranky old 40-year-old machine. So, yeah, it's breaking down all the time. There's always something is... The CRT is finicky. The controls are, weird and probably need to be entirely broken down and replaced again. The PCB has like weird little holes in it, and who knows how they got there. Like somebody screwed it into the cabinet wrong at one point. It looks like there's broken bits of wood and panelings missing and all sorts of things. Like there's the speaker is crackling. Like everything about it is slightly not quite right, but at the same time, it really makes it pretty magical when it does work. It's like, oh man, it's working. We better play this thing. And you play it until it breaks, and then you fix it again. And it's again kind of like the old car analogy. You're constantly you have to find sources for these things. These are old parts. Late 70s, early 80s. So you got to find other crazy people like you, and there's always somebody crazier with more stuff and more experience. And it's been amazing just to talk to so many other arcade owners, and they're extremely generous folks too, because they've been in it way longer than I have, and they got so much more stuff and knowledge, so they just want to share this. And half the time, like all the parts that I've gotten to, I haven't had to pay for any of them. It's just people been like, oh dude, please take these parts, take these spares off of my hands. I have so many. Please take them, fix up your machine, make it awesome again. And there's just all sorts of crazy, crazy cool enthusiast community for arcade machines. And there were like 1,100 or something of my cabinets ever made. That was it.
Oh, wow.
For the cabarets. There's not a lot of them out there. And there's a few hundred known to be still working. I'm sure there's more, but that's just on the online records. So you gotta make contacts in order for these things to be maintained and repaired, and you kind of end up going to like collectors meetings and swap meets and just seeing other people's things and like trading with them. And somehow I've ended up with like another 5 PCBs for games I don't even own. So
well, I got to build a whole machine around this one.
Yeah, that's kind of my idea. In fact, I now have that favorite arcade game that I played as a kid, Raiden 2. So I have the PCB for it. Just got to build a cabinet, which is kind of legit. I mean, that's how it was sold back in the day. It was just a PCB and like some stickers. Yeah. So I'd love to. Again, whenever I get some space and somewhere to actually work on these things. But build a cabinet, put that together. That's going to be a whole big fun adventure. But I'm down for it.
And you know what? I think a lot of us are down for playing original arcade games on original arcade cabinets. It is such a rewarding hobby. If you have the space, I would highly recommend it, and if you have the interest in it, I would highly recommend picking up a vintage arcade cabinet, especially if you like working on things and tinkering with things. It's a very rewarding hobby to get into. So that's as much of the conversation as I could fit into a 39-minute broadcast. If you want to listen to the entire conversation, Clint and I talked for well over an hour. Download the podcast. Get the podcast in your favorite podcast app. Geek Therapy Radio, an Apple podcast. I use Pocket Casts on Android, of course the iHeartRadio app. Look for the red, white, and black color scheme. That's Geek Therapy Radio. A big thanks for all my friends who came on to this episode this week. Clint, of course, from Lazy Game Reviews. Check them all out on YouTube. The 8-Bit Guy, David Murray, and Colin from the YouTube channel This Does Not Compute. Make sure you go check out and subscribe to all their YouTube channels. I owe them eternal gratitude for coming on Geek Therapy Radio this week. But most importantly, know that you, the listener, are worthy of love, and you're worthy of your own self-respect. We're all geeks about something, so lean into your geek thing. Also, be sure to visit my friends at Best Automotive in Kingwood on North Park. They'll take care of your classic car. They'll take care of your modern car. They're at Best Automotive in Kingwood. And that's going to do it. Thank you so much for listening to Geek Therapy Radio this week. Talk to you guys later.